Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mia Burke, and I work as program manager with Hanford Challenge. And if you're unfamiliar with Hanford Challenge, we're a nonprofit based in Seattle that focuses on a safe and effective cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site. And one of the most important things we do and what makes us unique is our support of workers on the front lines of cleanup. This is the 30th webinar of our Nuclear Waste Scholar Series, which is very exciting. If you're new to this series, we started it to inspire action and involvement with Hanford Cleanup by inviting speakers to share groundbreaking scholarship, art, research, and experience working with nuclear waste. It is my pleasure to introduce Erin B. Cole. Erin Cole, sorry. Erin is a public historian, museum consultant, and artist. They have a PhD in the history of the modern American West from the University of New Mexico and have worked as a historian and exhibit developer for both History Colorado and the Minnesota Historical Society. They are now a freelance museum consultant based in Denver. Erin has drawn and published several comics about nuclear landscapes and history in Colorado and the larger West. Their comic Plowshare, Nuclear Testing in Colorado came out in 2024. They are now working on a larger graphic history graphic memoir about nuclear Colorado, and we'll talk more about their work with you today. So just as a heads up, if you can't stick around for the whole presentation, feel free to leave. We will be recording the presentation and we'll share a link of the recording with everyone that registered. Thank you so much for joining us today, Erin. I will pass it to you now to talk about your work.
Awesome. Well, first off, thank you everybody for joining today. And I really want to thank the people, Mia and the other people at Hanford Challenge, for inviting me to be part of this series. I've actually seen quite a few of these Nuclear Waste Scholar Series webinars, and I was really, really excited when they asked me if I'd like to be part of this. So anyways, again, my talk today is called Cute Drawings of Terrible Things, Nuclear History Through Comics. And this title actually comes from a comment I had from somebody at a comic show I tabled at a couple years ago. They came up and looked at my stuff, which included some of my nuclear comics, but also some of my comics about brain injury and some other things. And he was just like, I don't quite get it. Like, your drawings are so cute, but you draw about all of these terrible, horrible things. Like, how do you make those work together? And the answer is that's something I'm still trying to figure out. But it kind of inspired the title for today's talk. So again, here's some stuff about me. I'm a historian, I'm a museum professional, and a cartoonist. And here is my contact info. Littlebraincomics.com is my website. And there's my email. So I have published 3 comics about nuclear history on my website, and this QR code will take you to them. And there's also a kind of an actual direct link there at the bottom, which is Little Brain Comics Hanford Challenge -2. And I'll repeat this at the end of the talk as well. But if you want everything I'm going to talk about today, you can actually read online. So I like to make my comics accessible to people so they can teach them in classes and other things. But there's also a link to my store where there's actually the paper ones, which look like this. So again, these are my comics. They're a mix of memoir, history, and landscape analysis. The first one was published in 2020, which is the one in the center, which is The Desert Keeps Receipts, which is about a tour that I did of the Nevada test site. In 2022, I published the one on the right, How to Visit Rocky Flats in 20 Confusing Steps, because everything about Rocky Flats is confusing. And then on the left is my newest one, Plowshare, Nuclear Testing in Colorado, which is a history of the Project Relucent and Project Rio Blanco underground well simulation tests in Western Colorado. A totally normal topic for a comic. So anyway, so first off, I just want to say that there is a lot of comics out there about nuclear history. And these are just some that I kind of thought of right off the bat when I was putting this slide together. together yesterday. So my stuff is a very small spot in this huge thing. So we have a couple of manga here, one about Hiroshima, one about Fukushima. Um, there's like my friend Andy Kirk published a comic about the Nevada test site. Nuking Alaska is the other comic about Project Plowshare. There's more than one. There's this French like history of the Manhattan Project came out later, and then there's just all sorts of stuff out there. There comics, popular, not popular, about nuclear history. This is a panel from a little dot comic from 1955 that cracks me up constantly, and it's actually the like what I put on all my research notebooks. So again, all of these like artists and writers have reasons to do things in comics. For Japanese artists, they're working a very long tradition of historic manga. My friend Andy wanted to do a comic that would be really, really easy to teach in classes and engage students. And I like comics, I draw comics basically because it's really the only way, the best way I've found to communicate. It's kind of how my brain works. My brain works in comics form. And one of the things I very much like about drawing comics is the fact that there's some aspects of nuclear history that really come across really easily in comics. Think about secrecy. There's so much secrecy in the history of nuclear production, testing, disposal, and comics help kind of pierce that kind of secrecy. Think about invisibility, the fact that radiation is invisible. There's like a lot of nuclear landscapes are you can't really see on the surface of the earth what's happened there. So but you can use comics to kind of illustrate that. And also uncertainty, kind of mental states, that sense of am I in danger by being here? What is the effect of working at this site for many years? What did that do to me? So comics is really good at kind of subjectivity and interiority. And that's one of the things I really like about drawing comics in general, and specifically drawing nuclear comics. So I have been interested in nuclear history for a very, very long time. So I grew up in Grand Junction, Colorado, which during the was the Manhattan Project site for kind of domestic uranium procurement. Then it became one of the kind of AEC's major sites. It had a uranium processing mill. It was where like uranium from the Colorado Plateau was put on trains to other parts of the state, to other parts of the country. So it has a really kind of robust kind of nuclear history. So this is actually a historic photo from Grand Junction's second annual Miss Atomic Energy pageant in 1955. So the winner, who you can see with her trophy, got a big pile of uranium ore as her reward. I don't know what she did with it. I think I first saw this when I was in high school. It may have been at the local museum, and I was absolutely fascinated by it. I mean, at the time, I was kind of fascinated by the 50s in general, like the clothing and things like this, but just seeing this just stuck in my head for decades. I still think of this photo all the time. And I tried to paint it in art school, and I did a really, really miserable job with it. So my personal and family history is also really tied into nuclear history. My dad is a geologist, and he did uranium exploration for a DOE contractor in Grand Junction at the late 70s and early 80s. And then when I was growing up during the 80s, one of the big stories in town was that Grand Junction was removing all of its uranium mill tailings from underneath schools and houses. And this is a picture of them removing it from the sidewalks in downtown Grand Junction. So, I mean, the uranium mill there offered people kind of fill dirt, which was mixed with uranium mill tailings, and people took it to put in their gardens and build their houses and things like this. So one of my very other really kind of like formative memories is when they were taking the uranium mill tailings out of my middle school, and they didn't shut school down. They just put all the kids in half the school and then had all the workers taking out the contamination in the other half of the school. And I remember noticing on the playground that all the workers had protection, but none of the kids did. So that was kind of almost like where my like being a historian came from. So anyway, so as Mia mentioned, I'm a historian. I have a PhD from the University of Mexico, which is I did not actually specialize in nuclear history there. I did both of my MA and my PhD on urban environmental history, but it's obviously a very good place to be interested in nuclear history at. There were a couple of faculty who specialized in it. We took trips to the Trinity site occasionally. A lot of my colleagues did work at both Los Alamos and Sandia. So it was kind of, it kind of helped me kind of get more interested, get reinterested in nuclear history. It was being there. But I ended up going into museums instead of going into academia. And I worked again at two history museums, one in Colorado and one in Minnesota. And here's just some examples of exhibits that I worked on. And why that's relevant to this is like working in exhibits are basically very large comics. You have text, you have graphics, you're presenting a narrative that mixes them and that people walk through. And you have to take a really complex historic story, and make it simple, straightforward, engaging, and something that people will want to move through. So I actually started drawing comics in my 20s and kind of wasn't very good at it. But the big reason I wasn't very good at it is I didn't really know how to tell a story. I didn't know really I didn't have a good topic. I didn't know how to tell a story. Working in museums taught me how to tell stories to the public and taught me how to engage people in really, really complex stories, because every nuclear story is really complex. Um, while I was in Minnesota, I fell and slipped on the ice and I had a traumatic brain injury. And I was already starting to draw comics again by this time, but I started really drawing comics seriously during my TBI. This little blob here is named Little Brain. That's actually me. And I use Little Brain as a way to kind of show all my friends and family in Colorado and around the country what was going on. I had a really hard time writing. I had a really hard time typing, but I could draw. And so I started kind of using comics to really communicate inner states, what's going on in my head. And when I started working on these, I ran into this kind of school of cartooning called graphic medicine. And it's basically people using comics in healthcare situations. Patients telling their own stories, using comics as a therapeutic medium, but graphic medicine really focuses on interiority, subjectivity, and the gap between what patients are told that they're supposed to think what they're supposed to be experiencing, what they're actually experiencing. So I learned a lot from going to conferences, reading and stuff like this about um, how to use comics as a way to really depict interior states, thinking about kind of internal narratives and things like this. And then I started applying this to my comics work about history. And my work about nuclear history comes not only directly out of my public history work in museums, it also comes out of my experience in the graphic medicine community. So, which is not really these are not really normal paths to becoming a history cartoonist. Let me just say that. So I don't think there is a normal path. So anyway, so again, in 2020, I published The Desert Keeps Receipts. I was published online at a site called Contingent Magazine. And it is about a bus tour that I took in 2019 to the Nevada test site. So the tour was part of the 2019 Western History Association conference in Las Vegas. And of course, I was going to sign up for it. So we had an all-day tour. We were not allowed to bring phones or cameras, but we were allowed to take notes. And so I drew through the entire thing. So this is actually my sketchbook from the tour itself. Things are really shaky because I was trying to draw as we were driving down the road. But the tour itself was such an interesting experience that I kept, even after I was done with this, I kept drawing about being on this bus and using my notes from the actual tour. And eventually, during the pandemic, I was furloughed for a long time. So I actually had time to turn this into a comic. And so what the comic is really about is kind of, again, this is about we're a bus of his professional historians. We have kind of expectations that we're going to be able to like get really some really in-depth answers about what the test site is about, what happened here, what are the implications of the tests, that both the underground and above ground and underground tests that happened here, what's the effect of this on the landscape, on people, and things like this. But what we actually had was a tour guide who it was a tour site veteran. He didn't really want to talk about any of these things. He wanted to talk about big bombs, big craters, deep shafts, and we learned things about which physicists were really good at horseshoes and the best place for a stake near the test site in the 1960s. And he was also just like, it's a really shame we're not testing nuclear weapons anymore. So there is this kind of like gap between what people expected and what we got. But at the same time, we're still getting enough like information during the tour about what happened at the test site and what a tragedy the test site actually is, that I felt everybody kind of getting really like raising their shields and almost like basically like protecting themselves in a cloud of cynicism. So the entire comic is about almost the kind of the affective experience of going to the Nevada test site. And it's, like bus full of historians is also a bus full of cynicism. Just like people were cracking like the worst possible jokes during this because everybody just had this huge emotional load to deal with as we drove through the site. And I was doing this, but I was also dealing with this other emotional issue, which is I felt so at home there. So I loved being at the site. The site, I mean, the Nevada desert is stunningly gorgeous, but I just, as somebody who grew up in the desert and at the time was in Minnesota, I was just like, this site is so tragic. What we've done here is really awful. Look at all of the wounds that the landscape is thing, but at the same time, this feels so at home. Like I am so enjoying being here. And again, like it was just like I trust the desert. Like I trust that it's going to tell me what happened here. And the time I was working on some project, I didn't know how to read the landscape in Minnesota. It was green. Everything really felt hidden under like foliage and things like this. So I just wanted a comic that really kind of explored those kind of the emotional impact of being at the site. So so it took about a year to go from like these original things to the final project. Um, Again, like the goal wasn't to really share the test site. Like a 20-page comic can only do so much, but just to talk about the kind of the affective like experience of being there, of like knowing you're not really getting a really good story, but you're still immersed in this site that has so many stories to tell. So I published this. It got a lot of really, really positive feedback from historians. And it also kind of just like, huh, like I feel like I have a lot more to say about this topic. So hold on. So soon after that, I quit my job and I moved back to Colorado and I've been where I've been ever since. I, starting my own like exhibit development and consulting firm, but comics is also kind of what I do. And so when I got back, I was, thinking about like, okay, well, there's a ton of nuclear history in Colorado. Maybe I'll just start like going to sites and seeing what I want to like say about them, or do I want to say anything about them? So one of the first sites I visited was the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge. So those of you who do not know, Rocky Flats was a weapons production facility just northwest of Denver. They produced plutonium triggers for our nation's nuclear weapons arsenal. It was so poorly run and so polluted that it got jointly raided by the EPA and the FBI. And then they cleaned it up, depending on how you feel about air quotes. And now the buffer zone around the factory is a national wildlife refuge, which you can do walk around. So I went over there. I decided to go take a walk around it because I'd actually never been to the actual site before. And it was a very frustrating site. First off, like that site is beautiful. Like, I mean, the front, there's no unbeautiful parts of the Colorado Front Range. It was beautiful. Like there's birds, lots of bird watchers. It's very calm. But at the same time, like you know that the whatever was here, you aren't really allowed to see. Like everything felt like kind of been erased. So after I went to this, I went to a brewery and I started drawing in my sketchbook, and here's the drawings that I made. Um, that basically become the comic, and trying to struggle again with like, what is the site telling us? What's the story that you're getting there, and what's the actual story? So I actually went and visited both the wildlife refuge, that's the entrance gate on the left, and then nearby there's a sculpture and kind of historic marker called the Cold War horse, made by artist Jeff Geep, um, which is actually kind of like his father worked at Rocky Flats for a long time, and so he created this as a tribute to the workers there. And next to it, and you'll see kind of my drawing of it later, is an actual historic marker saying what happened at Rocky Flats, like a pretty unvarnished version of it. So I spent a lot of time in these trying to figure out like how do I talk about, like, do I want to talk about these things? How do I talk about these things? So what I ended up doing was basically kind of almost like an instructional guide on how to interpret the site. I was kind of expecting to use this as like, like the audience I had in mind for this was other public history professionals, people who were using this in public history comics or classes and things like this. So I just kind of took people through my mental steps of going there, asking questions, thinking about how, like, what do I even do with this? So anyway, so I'll just be honest, this first step 2 here on the left is a joke for Coloradans. Again, we have 2 cursed pieces of land that are former military / Cold War sites that are now wildlife refuges, and people get them mixed up all the time. So to make sure you're going to Rocky Flats and not the Rocky Mountain Arsenal where they made sarin gas. So just my tip for any visitors. So I basically just kind of took myself, again, drew myself in this space asking questions like, okay, like who wrote these? Like who wrote this panel? Like why is this a wildlife refuge? Who thought putting a plutonium trigger factory near a major city was a good idea? Things like that. Um, but the really kind of meta story is the 2 different kinds of interpretation there. So when you actually come to the wildlife refuge, there is an interpretive plaque that has a little bit of a story. And then at the Cold War Horse, there's another historic plaque. And they have very, very different goals. The historic plaque at the actual refuge is kind of like blah, 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 blah. Here's what happened. And it's kind of meant to kind of reassure you that this place is clean. You're okay walking. You're going to be okay walking around. If you take your kids here, they're not going to be, they're not going to like get thyroid cancer decades from now. It's meant to reassure. It's meant to make you feel safe. Whereas the Cold War horse panel is meant to unsettle you. It's meant you to be like, well, what happened here? And it's also right on the edge of Candelas, which is a huge development that has been built right next to the wildlife refuge. So you see that, you see the wildlife refuge, and then you see all of these brand new houses being built right next to it. So the comic is kind of like, how do we make sense of all of this? So this is the part of the comic where I actually kind of sketch out the story each tells, and you'll notice these pages have the exact same format and they're basically parallel constructions. And I wanted them to actually almost be like to have the exact same look. So that would be very clear that we're comparing and contrasting here. And like the center panel and the bottom row is almost identical. But just like, here's a very vague hooray. And here's a like, huh, this, I have way more questions than this site can answer history. So, so I really wanted to talk a little bit like how do these sites construct their meaning? But then I also want to talk about the physicality of being in this space. Again, these are beautiful. This is a beautiful space. Like there's wind, there's the front range right there. There's the Flatirons. You're walking through, like you can actually kind of see like some prairie restoration. Um, just like you're in this really beautiful space. It's quiet, unlike the rest of the metro area. There's all of these plants. You hear the birds chirp. So I wanted to talk a little bit about being the kind of like the experience of trying to be present in that space and not letting my head always be like, this is a terrible place, but yet it's so pretty. Is actually kind of being present and kind of trying to show visitors through different kind of viewpoints, like either like back of the head, showing my feet, like just all of the different ways that you can take in the sensory experience of being at the Rocky Flats Wildlife Refuge. So I published that online. I later published it in paper. Um, and it at the time, what I thought I was going to do with this and is turn this into a bigger project. I was like, oh, I'm going to go to different nuclear sites in Colorado, maybe in the larger Intermountain West, and talk about that gap between what they say in their interpretation and then what they actually are. And I decided pretty quickly not to do that because most of these sites are interpreted badly in kind of the same way. And there's really only so many ways I can draw myself frowning at an interpretive panel. And then, like like talking to people about these projects, both Rocky Flats and the Nevada test site, I also realized that there's a lot of people who don't actually know the history of these places. That like I know a lot of people who are really fascinated with nuclear history, but a lot of people just have no idea, and they're including people that live in and around these sites. Like for example, when I was doing the Nevada test site comic, I had two groups of people that I worked on it. I kind of like workshopped it with. One was some historians, some of them who were actually on the same tour, and they're like, "Oh, this totally makes sense. This is great." And then I also workshop it with a group of cartoonists that at the time we were all meeting because we had nothing else to do during the pandemic, and we're all critiquing each other's work. And I sent them the first draft of what became The Desert Keeps Receipts, and they're like, "This is really interesting, but what is the Nevada test site again?" And so I was explaining this, and they're like, "No way, really, really?" And I realized, again, like that's actually much more of an audience is people who just don't really know that much about these sites. They don't really know a lot about America's like nuclear history. They don't know about kind of the damage that has been done to landscapes and bodies and things like that throughout, since the 1940s. So, like in some ways, like this comic you're seeing here, Rocky Flats, has a very, very narrow audience. It's for public history people like me. Um, but so I decided to kind of broaden things and actually think about doing an actual graphic history rather than like, oh, here's some bad interpretive panels, because there's so many bad interpretive panels out there. So, and that is how we get to the comic I published last year, which is about Project Rulison and Project Rio Blanco. And for those of you who don't know that much about these two tests, they are part of the larger Project Plowshare initiative that the AEC undertook in the 70s, in the late 50s through the early 70s, to try to find peaceful uses for nuclear weapons. So they had a lot of ideas. Almost all of them were bad. Most of them didn't work. But the things that they actually didn't do end up being more about energy exploration. So both Project Rulison, which is in 1969, and Project Rio Blanco, which is in 1973, are intended to they're both underground nuclear detonations, and they're intended to see if you nuke some rocks underground, will that release a lot of natural gas? It's basically fracking with an atomic weapon. And I'll just give you the short end. Yes, that does release a lot of natural gas. The problem is the natural gas is then radioactive. So, and no, and the AEC and its partners in the oil and gas industry realize that no one's going to buy radioactive nuclear gas. So they're technically a failure. So, and that's actually Project Rio Blanco is basically the end of the entire Plowshare initiative. So so I have been really interested in these stories for a long time. Again, I come from my family has a strong connection to oil and gas, especially in the Piceance Basin, which is a big oil and gas basin in northwestern Colorado, which is where all of the plowshare, these two plowshare tests take place in. But also when I was like I had kind of heard about Rulison for a long time, but when I was working at History Colorado, my job was actually being the assistant state historian. And we had a request from the media to talk about failure in Colorado history. And that was actually the most fun project we ever worked on. It's just researching all of these different ways that things have failed in Colorado. And then at one point, I'm like, oh, wait, wasn't there those bomb tests in northwestern Colorado? And it's like, oh yeah, those really failed. So so that kind of got me interested in thinking about this. And then in 2022, my dad and I went and visited the Project Rulison site, which you see on the left. The site on the right is the Project Rio Blanco site. They're about 45-minute drive from each other in Garfield County, Colorado. So anyway, so I knew I had a sense that I really wanted to do a comic about this, but I was going to have to do a lot of explanation. Like, what is the AAC? Like, people on this call know what the AAC is. A lot of people don't. What's the Piceance Basin? Why these places? Why are they looking for gas? What do you see now? So I knew that this was going to be a lot more straightforward history, but I'm also kind of mixing that in with like reports about my visit to the site. I talk a little bit about what's the experience of being there like, what's the interpretation there like, things like that. Because I was doing an actually more straightforward history for the previous two comics, I mostly just relied on my photos of the sites or my recollection of what the sites look like. This one I'm actually drawing I'm drawing from historic photos, historic documents, and things like that. So I'm making a lot of decisions about how to incorporate kind of primary source documents into this. Like, how do I choose how to depict the site? So this is actually a historic photo. I think it's an AAC photo that I used as basically the basis for how I would depict the Project Rulison site throughout the comic. This is what you see on the right is the first time it actually appears in the comic. You can definitely see the similarities there. I have a very simple, very cartoony style. So for me, a lot of times, especially when I'm taking complex source material, is how do I render it in a way that's true to my own style, but it's still true to the actual source. Like this, like what details do I actually encourage? So I have like the little shaft that they drill to actually put the device in underground. I have some of the trailers. I have some of the trucks. But I am obviously very much simplifying it, but it is, it is based on this photo. And this comic does actually have like fairly extensive footnotes. But at the same time, you can see I can actually also kind of exaggerate a little bit. Obviously, the detonation is not that close to the surface, which I have that little thing saying not to scale. But you can, like, comics lets you combine things in ways that let you tell stories kind of like a little more creatively. So I do like actually being able to take a little bit of license with how I depict things, but always being very straightforward about what I'm doing. So because as a historian, I know about the importance of using your sources, being faithful to them, letting people know where you're getting your materials from. So one of my uh, things is like, who do I depict in this? I don't have images of most of the people that I'm, using the words from. So I was using a lot of like articles and transcripts of like public hearings where people were really upset about both Rulison and Rio Blanco. So had their words, but not their images. But I also had some pictures. Like, so this picture on the left, this is Claude Hayward. He was a potato farmer outside of what was then called Grand Valley, Colorado. And he, like the AAC, uses his land for the Rulison project, kind of in exchange for he would get some of the royalties from any of the gas that was sold. And as we know, none of the gas is sold, so he kind of gets shafted by this project. But I have a picture of him, but he's also not turning in the right direction. So I had to kind of like, well, what would this guy look like if he turned just a couple of degrees towards the camera? Um, and then I also had the issue of like a lot of people, like there's a lot of voices in here that I don't know what they look like. I don't know what the rooms that they're in like. But at the same time, does that matter? So this is a page where I'm kind of giving kind of talking about the gap between what people from the AAC and its industry partners are saying at these public meetings, and then what people are actually like saying in response to them. Again, they're in like schoolrooms and little community centers around Western Colorado. And so, but I kind of decided that what they were saying is more important than actually depicting the room that they're doing that in. So this is the only page like this in the entire comic. As a cartoonist, this page still makes me very nervous. Like, where are the people? What are they doing? But I kind of felt that this really highlights both the arguments for and against um, these two tests. Again, people, almost no local people are excited about these. I mean, there's a little bit of like, well, if it turns into jobs, that's cool. But no one in that part of Western Colorado is running like, yes, please come nuke our gas fields. So, and then the biggest one, this is actually the one that took the hardest for me to figure out, is again like the major protagonist in this comic is the Atomic Energy Commission. And again, how do I depict the AEC? And again, I know what AEC commissioners look like. There's plenty of pictures of like Glenn T. Seaborg and Dixie Lee Ray and all of those people. And I'm like, do I want to draw them? you know but one of the things that really comes up a lot in comics is continuity. How do you let people know that the thing that's happening on page 3 and the thing that's happening on page 30 are happening the same person or thing or something is doing that? So like I showed you that image of the landscape at Project Rulison, that gets that almost that exact same like kind of slanty like landscape keeps appearing throughout. So people know visually that's, oh, we're back to that site, we're back to that site, we're back to that site. And the more research I realized it didn't actually really matter who was in charge of the AEC at the time, because like Plowshare just kept going. So what I ended up doing is I was just kind of doodling, and I'm like, well, maybe I'll just make the AEC logo a character in this. And that actually kind of made everything kind of come together. First off, I didn't have to worry about like drawing different people and drawing them correctly. And also, I draw so cartoony that it just felt like turning the logo into a cartoon character worked really well. So here we have our friend, the AAC, hanging out with its nuke friends. And in order to draw like these nuclear devices, I actually went and did a lot of research about how did cartoonists during the Cold War, especially in the 50s and 60s, depick nuclear weapons, especially in political cartoons, everything, and almost always it was the cone shape, it was like the gray cone. So I decided to like borrow that visual language for this comic as well. And so we have the AAC. It keeps appearing throughout the comic. I honestly had to draw it a couple of times in different poses, and I kept tracing it so that I could, because it's so simple, but getting like the little dots on it were cracked. Where this actually the most challenging thing I drew was the AAC logo over and over and over again. So, but I also, like, in addition to this history, talk, in a way that like creates continuity throughout my work, talk about what it's actually like to go to those places now. Um, so the Project Rulison site is actually not that far off of I-70 through Western Colorado. It's really close to the town of Parachute. So people go there all the time. And but when you go there, it's just this kind of normal place. And it's got some scrub. It's actually like still on, like, the site is still technically on private land. So you can't really go on it, but you can see the marker. And there's a new interpretive sign put up that was put up by DOE Legacy Management sometime in the last couple of years. But wait, when my dad and I went there, the person who either owned the land that the Rulison site is on or something was mowing. And they're just wearing a hat and they're like, "Hey, everybody. Hey, folks, how's it going?" And then right up the road is like a trailhead. So there was just, people there like getting around to hike with their dogs. It was this completely normal site. And then we went to the Project Rio Blanco site, which is much more isolated. It was like surrounded by cattle. So it was just like these like normal rural Western places that, if you didn't know what to look for, if you didn't know where to go, you wouldn't know that there was that, like, thousands of feet below you was still this reservoir of radioactive natural gas. Um, so again, I also do a little bit about the actual interpretive sign that's at Rulison. Again, it's pretty good, but having written signs like this, having done a lot of research on this, just another opportunity to think about, like, what are you reading on a historic marker? What's there? How is it put together? And what's actually missing? So because it's well done, but it's just like, like public opposition. It was very loud, and there was a lot of anger and energy in those protests. So anyway, so just again, like, another opportunity to talk about the actual work of interpreting historic sites. So I'm almost done here. So again, like, I'm kind of moving on to another chapter, I guess, in my nuclear history, like, anthology or something like this. And one of the things I've been thinking about doing is just doing a larger graphic history / memoir about nuclear Colorado. Again, I've already done big parts of it. I don't know if that's actually going to happen, mostly because I'm starting to work on the next chapter, which is a graphic history of my hometown. Of, again, you saw those sites beforehand of miss atomic energy, mill tailings. So I am actually starting to move into telling the story of my hometown, which also talks about telling a story about my family. Um, what is it like growing up in a site that is, has kind of this real, like, atomic legacy, both, in like buildings that are still there, like how like things around the city are funded, but also, like, like, there's still mill tailings around. There's still stuff. What does that all add up to? So these are just some images from doing some work at the National Archives this spring. These are all the Grand Junction Project Office records in the Department of Energy records. So down on the left, that is a picture of the old tailings pile, and that was adjacent to downtown Grand Junction. And then you have kind of a local newspaper reporting on the end of uranium milling in Grand Junction. And again, I don't really know where this is going to go. I have a ton of work to do on it, so it may end up being so exhausting in many ways that this might be like the project. Is just telling the story of my hometown. So that's where this kind of ends. Again, this is the QR code where you can see see the comics that I just talked about. There's a little, again, there's a URL down at the bottom. And then I think it's time for questions. So I will stop sharing real quick.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erin. I love how you bring this critical and questioning lens to these spaces and the narratives that are presented. You're pushing back on the kind of status quo DOE
Mhm.
narrative. I find it really fun to read the comics and look through them. And people were in the chat comparing similar reactions to the B reactor tour at Hanford and Chernobyl and
Oh
these
my God, yes.
in
And
space.
I haven't taken the beat I haven't been to Hanford, and but
Um,
it's kind of on my list for the next couple of years just to visit. And like I know enough people who've worked there and who've worked on his histories and or interpretation there that I really want to kind of actually get the tour. But I also did Oak Ridge last year, and that was a whole lot of like uh like you're showing me this, but I know all these other things happened. And it was a really that was also a really fascinating tour, but I decided I didn't want to draw a comic about it.
okay. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Please put in the chat any questions or feel free to use the Q&A feature as well. We do have first question is what is your favorite part of making these comics?
Oh my God, that's a really good question. Um, I both love and hate all of the parts of making comics. But I think my favorite part is actually seeing how people react to them. So comics are really, really hard to draw. I will just say that. Again, like almost all of the things that I shown took, like Rocky Flats, I think only took about a couple of months to do. Plowshare took about a year. Rocky, the keeps receipts took a year, but that's actually just the drawing. That's going like almost all of those comics went through a couple of different versions. Like like the Project Plowshare one went through probably like three different versions where I would draw them, like outline them, draw them, decide I hated it, adapt it. So it takes a lot of work to get them to the state that they're in. And even though I do draw very cartoony, there's still a lot of work to try to decide how do I depict something? How do I use the AC as a character? How do I, what does this page want to be? How do I make sure that I am, doing things consistently throughout? How do I make sure people want to turn the page? Constructing comics is a lot of work, and there's actually this kind of thing that cartoonists say a lot about their own work. They're like, this took 15 years to draw, and it took somebody 3 hours to read. So that part is really frustrating. I love the research. I love thinking about it, but I'll be honest, when I'm working on it, I'm just like, "Arr." So I was so happy when Plowshare was done. But the best part has actually been seeing how people react to it. How it actually makes all of that feel worthwhile.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and it was fun to hear today your thought process behind, creating that Atomic Energy Commission character or the two pages side by side for Rocky Flats, I believe. And like the process behind that was so interesting because it's not something we get by necessarily reading it. Um,
Yeah, and I've been reading comics my whole life. And, again, like if you're a writer, the more you read, the better a writer you are. In comics, it's kind of the same. Like, you know, drawing comics makes you pay attention. Like, how is this page actually put together? How is the eye designed to flow around this? One thing that's really different about comics than just writing is thinking about like how am I going to frame this panel? Like, okay, so I'm drawing me at Rocky Flats. Is it a wide view? Is it the back of my head? Is it my feet? Am I, like how am I depicting whatever, like how am I framing whatever is going in that panel? And then how does it work with the next one? You spend a lot of time, if you read a lot of comics, you kind of absorb that, but then you have to think about like, okay, this is a much more complex, like these are much more complex way this is much more complex than I thought it was going to be. This is not exactly how like when I'm when I was learning to write as a historian, you still think a lot about craft and you think about how to construct an argument, but it's just like you're not just like, how am I like, is this paragraph going to start in the middle? Anyway, like you
Yeah.
just have way more things to think about in constructing your page than you do when you're just writing.
Mhm. Yeah. We have a question about if your comics have received any pushback from nuclear advocates.
They really haven't. Again, like I part of this is that most of the people who've read my stuff are either also historians, um, they're public historians, they're people who just like self-publish indie comics. And I have heard from people who are like active in like nuclear activism who've seen my stuff and they've mostly just liked it. I haven't really received a lot of pushback for anything that I've done. And I think some of this is because I'm centering so much of this in my own experience being at the place. And, you know, it's hard to argue with someone else's perception of a place because you're not them. Um, so I think as I'm working on this Grand Junction thing where I'm going to be like doing more interviews and incorporating more of other experiences, I'm going to have to be a lot more careful. Again, like taking a lot more care towards my sources, the community I'm talking about, which is a community I care about very much, and things like that. I will say, like the one time I was the most nervous is I got an email from Jeff Geep, who is the artist who did the Cold War horse, and I saw that email. I'm like, uh-oh, and then but he really really liked it,
Oh,
so
good.
he's like, oh look, like he's like I'm really glad that you went there and saw my incorporated it into the comic. So.
Oh, that's great. There's a question about whether schools in Colorado are using and teaching with these comics.
One of the reasons I put them online is because I wanted people to engage with them. And I've done other comics about public history work that have been taught a lot in like museum studies courses and things like that. So I do know that almost all three of the nuclear comics have been taught in classes. Sometimes I know it's been taught in they've been taught in a couple public history courses. I actually just gave a talk about um, my nuclear comics in a class that it was about kind of landscape history, like giving students new tools to think about landscape history. Plowshare in specifically was designed for Colorado history courses at the college level or at the high school level, mostly because there's just not very much written about that. There's
Mhm.
actually not that much written about kind of nuclear history in Colorado at all. I mean, there's definitely some books out there. There's some memoirs, but when I've talked to people who are teaching kind of the 60s and 70s in Colorado, and there's just like, there's a few things that they can turn to, but having a free kind of online resource, especially since like the students that are coming through are very visual. There are a lot of students who have grown up reading graphic novels, being especially young adult ones, or reading manga. So that was actually one of the like audiences I had in mind. And so I know it's been taught in a couple of Colorado history courses, which was my intent.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Let me just see because we have a lot of comments in the chat. Lots of lovely comments in the chat, which I can send to you later.
Oh,
Uh,
great.
and a lot of a lot of requests for a Hanford comic. Um, I love hearing about your process. I follow your visits to museums around the world that interpret and commemorate nuclear history. Is the US less willing to acknowledge this history?
That's a really good question. Um, And because we do have, if you go to Hanford or Los Alamos or Oak Ridge, they have like a whole kind of like range. Like they have like a little tourism industry around nuclear history. And again, like those are all kind of part of the larger national NPS site, NPS Manhattan Project, National Historic Site project. So it's I think it's a really good question though, because as we know, nuclear sites are everywhere, especially around the West. Um, unless you're in like specialized museums like the Atomic Testing Museum in Las Vegas, which is kind of and other ones, you're not really going to get a lot of nuclear history. And part of this, like I have a lot of theories as to why this is, and I'll just so these are kind of some of them. One is like, again, a lot of like the impact of nuclear like production, testing, things like happened elsewhere.
Mhm.
Japan, the like South Pacific, rural West, like native reservations. A lot of the actual impact is to places that people don't really like. A lot of people in the United States don't really think that much about. People there think very much about them, um, but um, you know, like like the Smithsonian isn't necessarily going to have something about nuclear testing. So another one is that I think there's it's I mean I think a lot of like museums don't do well with things that are in really recent memory, unless they're doing something very specific like doing kind of like community memory projects, doing stuff that's really kind of co-created with the people impacted. um, and more and more museums are doing this. The question is how do we do that in a nuclear site? And I can actually talk a little bit about my experience at History Colorado. Because again, when I was there, one thing that we actually really wanted to do, and this still gets talked about all the time there, is do kind of an Atomic Colorado exhibit. Because I mean, first off, Colorado has such a huge Cold War history. It's a site that has mining, milling, testing, weapons production, protests. It has kind of all of this stuff. But one of the things is like again, like a lot of that kind of question of secrecy, invisibility, and uncertainty. How do you do those in an exhibit form? Like there's just, like there's obviously like material culture from like Rocky Flats and all of these sites. How do you turn that into an engaging narrative? How do you, how do you do this in a way that engages like all of these communities around the state? And then one of the things that always kind of sunk it was that, our head of museum operations is like, she's like, I can't find a donor for that. I can't find a sponsor for that either. So, which is also why we never did oil and gas stories there. They've done a few things, like there's a little bit about Rocky Flats in one of their exhibits now and stuff like this. But I think it's complex. But all his stories are complex. Historic stories are complex. I think it's just very out of sight, out of mind for a lot of Americans, unless you're living in one of the affected community. But I can also say, like, in Grand Junction, there's like the cabin that was the Atomic Legacy cabin there, which was the first, which was leased by what becomes leased by the Manhattan Engineer District in 1943, is now like a little museum. And they do talk a lot about like kind of the legacies of this. They talk about kind of like the effects of mining and milling on native communities, effects of mill tailings in Grand Junction. But they also do a lot of, like there's a whole lot of like, oh look, uranium, it's great, it's this magic thing that we find in the ground, and then it transformed our economy. And so even though it's a place that's trying to talk like very realistically about like the effects of it, there's still this kind of very boomer like, and I don't mean like age wise, but just like kind of like like atomic boom chamber of commerce kind of woohoo about the story. So that was really rambly. I don't think I had a real answer, but I just think it's complex. It's not something a lot of people think about. And then, and a lot of these affected communities are still kind of like, what do we do with this? Is it cleaned up or is it not? I was thinking about some debates in Western Colorado about, oh, maybe we should have uranium mining and milling again, because that's actually going to bring prosperity to the region again. Um, there's a lot of it is really caught up in these kind of discussions about what are these places now? So, like what would it mean for there to be like, like a real like museum of uranium in Grand Junction? Like I don't know what that exactly would be. So I'm going to
Yeah.
stop. I'm just like coming up with ideas in my head.
There's someone asking, what is Little Brain Comics, if you could explain that again.
Oh, okay. So Little Brain Comics, again, if you saw earlier in the let me think I have anything handy, but so Little Brain is a character I created when I had a brain injury. So the little pink blob that you see, that my site is named after, and if you actually poke around on littlebraincomics.com, you'll definitely see it. So that's me. And again, like that's a character I created when I had a traumatic brain injury. And I've always really struggled with how to draw myself. And I do actually do it in some of these nuclear comics. But it was just really great to like, I just started using Little Brain as basically a stand-in for me in all of my comics. But I don't use Little Brain in the nuclear comics because it feels like they live in different universes. So when you actually see me in the nuclear comics, it is actually me drawing myself as me, the historian. So anywhere if you see my stuff, there's a little pink blob. That's Little Brain. So it's almost those are almost my interior states. So
Yeah, thank you. We have an you're there's an invite. Hanford has a sci-fi convention. They serve a drink called Toxic Waste, and they know that you would be very welcome at the convention. And I think I'm not seeing any other questions in the
okay.
chat.
And oh, I actually just saw that the Little Rain Comics site is actually all of my it's not all of my comics, but all the ones I've posted online are collected there from over like the last probably like last 9, 10 years. So you can see stuff that's all about there's just comics about all sorts of things. Just nuclear history is not the only thing I draw about.
Yeah, yeah. And people can purchase through you have an Etsy store,
Yes.
right?
So there's a link on if you want, yeah, again, like all of these comics are available free, but if you want paper ones, you can buy them through my website. So or my
Yeah,
Etsy store, which is linked from my website.
yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Erin, and sharing about your work with us. It's been
Oh,
a pleasure.
I just see somebody. Is your Etsy store also? Yeah, it's littlebraincomics.etsy.com. So anyway, or you can just Google Little Brain Comics Etsy. So all right.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. And thank you all so much for the excellent questions.